Today. That is how Jesus started this sermon, isn't he? He used the word today. He was preaching in his hometown synagogue in Nazareth, where he grew up. And by this time, he had moved to Capernaum, a less worthy town. Lots of Gentiles in Capernaum. I wonder how the people of Nazareth felt about Jesus moving away. You know, back then, not many young men left their hometowns, did they? Most boys that Jesus had played with as a child, they still lived in Nazareth. Most of them must have been in that congregation as Jesus sat to teach in the synagogue where he had grown up. I wonder how they felt, seeing their childhood friend sitting in the teacher's seat. I wonder how Jesus felt. You know, it's difficult to give a speech, isn't it? It's especially difficult to give a speech in front of people who are looking at you. We've all heard this. I read somewhere that the fear of public speaking is people are more scared of that than death itself. But to alleviate the fear, what do? You imagine your audience in their underwear, right? Yeah, to be truthful, that doesn't work from up here. I must admit, it's a pretty scary picture, too. So, I believe it would be especially difficult to come back to your hometown, to speak in your own synagogue or your church. Most of us, we'd probably be quaking in our boots. We'd be nervous. We'd be hesitant to do it. All kinds of things can go wrong in such a place, can't it? Not speaking loudly enough, or speaking hesitantly, or stuttering, or trying to speak and nothing coming out. But Jesus didn't have that problem. Someone handed him a scroll, and he unrolled it, and he found the part that he wanted to read. And then he read a couple verses from the prophet Isaiah. He said, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." You all remember that from last week's reading? Nothing new so far about this, though. The people of Nazareth, they all knew these verses, didn't they? These verses from Isaiah, they held great promise for them and their children. They promised a Messiah who would make poor Israel rich again. They promised a Messiah who would set them free from the oppression of the Roman soldiers. The Roman soldiers who walked their streets with impunity. Jesus stopped reading before he got to the part where Isaiah talked about vengeance. But the people of Nazareth, they knew that part too of this scripture. They were looking forward to the day when God would wreak vengeance on the Romans. So Jesus read these familiar verses from Isaiah, and then he sat down to teach. And you can be sure that every ear was cued to hear what he would say next. Jesus didn't hesitate, did he? The first word out of his mouth was today. He said, "Today, the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." The people were amazed at Jesus' gracious word. They had heard good reports of his work in Capernaum. Now Jesus, he seemed to be announcing that, having returned to Nazareth, he would begin his good work there. Today, he said, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing," here in Nazareth. Now, I don't know what the people of Nazareth really expected at that point, but they must have been sitting on the edge of their seats. Was Jesus planning to start a revolution right here in Nazareth? Was he planning to just rain fire down from heaven upon the Romans? The people had gotten out of bed that morning to an ordinary day, didn't they? And now Jesus was telling them that they could expect something special. I could imagine the smiles on their faces when he was saying that. And then they waited for him to explain. But Jesus, he continued by reminding them of a dark page in their history. Israel had been unfaithful, and God had sent them a drought. People starved. And then God sent the prophet Elijah. But not to save the Israelites, but to save a Gentile woman. And then Jesus reminded them of Naaman, not only a Gentile, but also a Syrian army general. God sent the prophet Elijah to heal Naaman of his leprosy. There were plenty of Jewish lepers, Jesus reminded that congregation, but God sent the prophet to heal a Gentile soldier. And that was more than those people could take there in Nazareth. They had expected Jesus to help them, but Jesus reminded them of God's help for Gentiles, the unworthy, the outsiders. It was as if Jesus had told them to expect a big winner today, but not them. And to make matters worse, he told them to expect the winner to be Gentiles, people outside of their faith community. And that was more than they could handle, wasn't it? They had heard Jesus of working miracles in Capernaum among Gentiles. And now that he was on home turf again, they expected him to do great things for them. What did Jesus say? He said, don't count on it, did he? And in their anger, they tried to kill Jesus. But Luke says that Jesus just passed through their midst and went his way. God saved Jesus. His time to die would come soon enough, but it had not come yet. And Jesus left Nazareth and returned to Capernaum, where he resumed his ministry, healing the poor, setting free the oppressed, giving sight to the blind. And some of those were Gentiles, outsiders, the unworthy people. Today came and went for Nazareth, didn't it? And those folks missed it. Those folks missed it because they thought of themselves as God's chosen people, which was true. But they hardened their hearts against God's helping anyone else. They wanted God to be their God and nobody else's. They tried to put God in a little box of their own making, but God was not having any part of it. The Messiah came to Nazareth on that day, and they tried to kill him. And today, Christ is in our midst, isn't he? He calls us to love the poor, the captive, the blind, the oppressed, the outsiders, people of no account, the undeserving. The people of Nazareth, they couldn't do it because they thought of themselves as deserving and the rest of the world as undeserving. They expected God to reward them and to strike down the bad guys. And perhaps with a little luck, God would put a sword in their hands and they would run the bad guys out of town. What they didn't understand was that God had called them to reach out to the undeserving, not to knock them down, but to lift them up. And today, Christ calls us to do the same. To love the unlovely. To help people who just can't get it together. To have patience with people who seem determined to drive us crazy. To show a bit of sympathy for the person who in the end got what they deserved. It isn't much easier for us today than it was for the people in Nazareth yesterday, is it? We want God to show us mercy, but to render justice on the other person. And there's another reason why we find it difficult to help beyond ours. Each one of us here, we have our own struggles, don't we? We're all struggling in our own way. Sometimes we barely have time and money to keep ourselves afloat, much less anyone else. So how can God expect us to help the poor when we feel poor ourselves? How can God expect us to help the oppressed when we serve people who really don't appreciate us? We have our own problems, God. Can't you see? Save us, and then maybe we can go out and help save someone else. The truth is that the people who reach out to the poor and the needy are often people who are poor and needy themselves. A person who has suffered understands suffering. Pain can breed compassion. Some years ago, I think I shared this 18 months ago or so, a little story about Mother Teresa when she took her tour of the United States. And she stopped at a church in Minneapolis. And there she called all the listeners who had come out to listen to her give a presentation. She asked them to take compassionate action, to help others in need. And when Mother Teresa concluded her remarks, a woman in a wheelchair raised her hand to ask a question. The woman who suffered from cerebral palsy. And her body moved convulsively as she spoke, and she had a great deal of trouble forming her words. The people say it was painful just to listen to her talk. But Mother Teresa just sat there patiently and waited for her to ask her question. And slowly and haltingly, the woman asked Mother Teresa what she could do to help other people. And Mother Teresa didn't hesitate for a moment. She said, "You can do the most. You can do more than any of us because your suffering is united with the suffering of Christ on the cross. And it brings strength to all of us." And that was a brave answer. I would have just knelt it into the carpet that day, having to try to come up with an answer for that type of question. I think truthfully I would have felt sorry for her and would have told her that she didn't need to do anything. But that would have been wrong. That woman needed an opportunity to do something important. And Mother Teresa told her how to do it that day. Mother Teresa gave her a blessing that day, to be truthful. That woman, in her poverty of spirit, was an inspiration to everyone who knew her. She joined a group known as the Sick and Suffering Co-workers of Mother Teresa. And after that encounter, she only lived another year or so. But she had an inspirational ministry after that meeting with Mother Teresa. And she is quoted as saying, "We are fortunate to have a share in Christ's cross. Lord, let us suffer without regret, for in your will and in your gracious acceptance of that same holy will lives our eternal destiny." So Christ came to that woman in a wheelchair through Mother Teresa's ministry. And the woman found herself ready to receive Christ, ready to obey his call, and ready to suffer if needed, and to allow Christ to transform her suffering into spiritual witness. That woman received a blessing that day. She spent the last days of her life giving a bit of that blessing to everyone that she came into contact with. When Jesus came to Nazareth, he said, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." The people of Nazareth, they were not ready for Jesus Christ. They were not ready to hear him, and they failed that test. They were looking for what they could get rather than what they could give. And the result was that they neither gave nor received anything. So the big day came, and they went away empty-handed. Jesus comes to us in the same way. He asks each one of us, he says, "Are you willing to be part of my ministry to the poor and the oppressed? Are you willing to reach out to the down and outers? Are you willing to love the unlovable?" Right here at Pikeside, Christ is with us today. And he's asking for a piece of our hearts. Don't be like the people of Nazareth. Be like the woman in the wheelchair who is ready to serve. And if you will do that, Christ will make it possible. He will fill your empty hands so that you have something to give. He will warm your heart so that your offering will matter. He started it today, didn't he? So be ready now, for Christ is here. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.